Sometimes a man's whole life comes down to one moment where everything he's ever worked for hangs in the balance. That's exactly where Lance Rawlings finds himself sitting in a Wyoming courthouse, watching greedy railroad men try to steal the land his father died protecting. The lawyers have twisted every law to favor the railroad company. The judge looks bought and paid for. Lance tries to speak up, but his voice shakes as he talks about 3 generations of family sweat in that soil. Everyone in the courtroom feels sorry for him, but sympathy won't save his ranch. Then something unexpected happens. The courthouse doors swing open, and in walks a wild-looking mountain man with gray hair and clothes that smell like campfire smoke. People start laughing because he looks like he belongs in the wilderness, not a courtroom. But this stranger's about to say one sentence that changes everything. What could a mountain man possibly know that would beat the railroad's lawyers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of sagebrush across the Wyoming territory as Lance Rawlings rode his horse along the fence line of what had been his family's ranch for 43 years. Every post, every strand of wire, every weathered gate told a story of backbreaking labor and stubborn determination. His grandfather's silver pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest pocket, a constant reminder that time was running short, not just for the day's work, but for everything his family had built. At 58, Lance bore the marks of a life spent working the land. His hands were permanently stained with dirt and calloused from decades of gripping reins, hammering posts and wrestling cattle. Deep lines etched his face like furrows in a well-plowed field, each one earned through seasons of squinting against prairie sun and bitter winter winds. His hair had gone silver at the temples, but his back remained straight and his grip firm. This was a man who had never learned to quit. The Rawlings Ranch stretched across 1,200 acres of the finest grazing land in Laramie County. Rolling hills, dotted with hardy Wyoming grass, gave way to timber-lined creek bottoms, where cattle could find shelter and water. Lance's father, Benjamin Rawlings, had claimed this land back in 1840, when Wyoming was still wild territory, and a man's word was his bond. Benjamin had fought Sioux warriors, survived 3 brutal winters in a log cabin he built with his own hands, and slowly assembled a herd from wild mustangs and stray cattle. Lance could still remember his father's stories, told by firelight during long winter evenings, how Benjamin had tracked a wounded grizzly bear for 3 days to protect the cattle, how he'd nursed the family through a diphtheria outbreak with nothing but whiskey and prayer, how he'd hidden the family's savings in a coffee tin buried beneath the kitchen floorboards during the worst of the Indian raids. Most importantly, how he'd ridden to Cheyenne in the spring of 1841 to register the land claim with the territorial governor, carrying the deed in his saddlebags through 200 miles of dangerous country. "This land chose us as much as we chose it," Benjamin used to say, running his weathered fingers through the soil. "Respect it, work it honest, and it'll take care of your children and your children's children." Now, as Lance dismounted near the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the property, those words felt like a promise he might not be able to keep. The railroad company's surveyors had been on his land for 3 weeks, measuring and marking with an authority that made his blood boil. They claimed the tracks needed to run right through the heart of his property, splitting the ranch in half and making it impossible to move cattle between the winter and summer pastures. The lead surveyor, a thin man named Caldwell Morrison, carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed maps drawn in distant offices trumped 40 years of sweat equity. Morrison wore city clothes, a wool suit that had never seen honest dirt and boots that had never stepped in anything worse than a puddle. He spoke in clipped Eastern phrases and referred to the ranch as the Morrison Tract, as if Lance's family had never existed. "I'm afraid there's been a clerical error in your deed, Mr. Rawlings," Morrison had said during their first meeting, spreading his survey maps across Lance's kitchen table without being invited. "Our research shows this land was never properly registered with the territorial government. The railroad company has filed a proper claim and received authorization to proceed with construction. Lance had studied those maps for hours, comparing them to his father's original deed. The boundaries didn't match. According to Morrison's paperwork, the Rawlings property was 300 acres smaller than what Benjamin had claimed, and the missing acreage happened to be exactly where the railroad wanted to lay track. It was too convenient to be an accident. My father registered this land in Cheyenne with Governor Campbell himself, Lance had protested. I've got the deed right here, signed and witnessed. Morrison barely glanced at the faded document. I'm sure you do, sir. But our legal department has researched the territorial records extensively. There's no record of any Rawlings claim filed in A41. Perhaps your father intended to register the land, but never completed the process. The suggestion that Benjamin Rawlings, a man who had never broken his word in his life, had somehow failed to properly secure his family's future was like a slap across Lance's face. But Morrison had the backing of the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company, which meant he had the backing of men with more money than most folks could imagine. When Lance consulted the local attorney, a nervous young man named Franklin Davis, the news was bleak. They've got political connections all the way to Washington, Davis had explained, fidgeting with his spectacles. Judge Morrison, he's no relation to the surveyor, mind you, has already ruled in favor of the railroad in 6 similar cases. I hate to say it, Lance, but unless you've got evidence that their paperwork is fraudulent, you're fighting a losing battle. Lance's wife, Mary Catherine, had taken the news with the quiet strength that had sustained her through 25 years of ranch life. She was a small woman with steel in her spine, the daughter of a Methodist preacher who had taught her that faith without works was dead. Her hands were as work-worn as Lance's, stained with garden dirt and kitchen burns, but her touch could gentle a spooked horse or comfort a fevered child with equal skill. We'll fight this, she had said simply, standing beside Lance as they watched the surveyors tramping through their pastures. Your daddy didn't survive the Indian Wars and the drought of '62 just to have his land stolen by men in fancy suits. Their neighbors were divided. Some, like old Henrik Peterson, who ran cattle on the adjoining property, believed Lance should take whatever settlement the railroad offered and start over somewhere else. You can't fight the railroad, Peterson had warned during a tense conversation at the general store. They've got more lawyers than we've got cattle. Cut your losses and move on. But others remembered Benjamin Rawlings and the kind of man he'd been. Tom Bradley, who owned the livery stable in town, had been helped by Benjamin during the hard winter of '69 when his horses were dying of disease. Sarah McKinnon, whose husband had been gored by a bull 10 years ago, still received beef from Lance every Christmas and firewood every October. These folks understood that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. The local newspaper, the Laramie County Gazette, had printed several articles about the dispute, but the tone was carefully neutral. Editor James Mitchell was a fair man, but he also understood that the railroad company bought advertising space and the Rawlings family did not. The articles presented both sides of the story while somehow managing to make the railroad's position sound more reasonable and legally sound. As October turned toward November, the pressure intensified. Railroad representatives began making visits to other ranches in the area, offering generous prices for right-of-way access. They painted a picture of prosperity and progress. New towns sprouting up along the rail line, increased land values, easier access to eastern markets for cattle and grain. Some ranchers signed contracts eagerly, seeing dollar signs and visions of modern convenience. But Lance knew the truth was more complicated. He'd seen what happened to towns and farms when the railroad came through other parts of Wyoming. The companies took what they wanted, paid what they felt like paying, and left communities forever changed. Small ranches got swallowed up by larger operations that could afford to ship cattle by rail. Local businesses withered when goods could be shipped in more cheaply from distant cities. The old ways of life, neighbor helping neighbor, communities bound together by shared struggle and mutual respect, gave way to the cold efficiency of corporate progress. The breaking point came on a grey Tuesday morning in mid-November. Lance was repairing a section of fence damaged by elk when he spotted riders approaching from the east. 3 men on horseback, moving with purposeful determination across his range. As they drew closer, he recognized Morrison and 2 men he'd never seen before, hard-looking types with gun belts and badges that glinted in the pale sunlight. "Mr. Rawlings," Morrison called out as they reined in their horses 20 feet away. "I believe you know why we're here." Lance straightened slowly, keeping his hands visible and his voice steady. "This is still my land, Morrison. You've got no business riding across it without permission." One of the strangers, a thick-set man with a drooping mustache, urged his horse a step closer. "I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Vernon Pike. I've got a federal court order authorizing the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company to take possession of this property pending resolution of their legal claim." The paper Pike handed him was official enough, complete with stamps and seals that meant nothing to Lance, but apparently meant everything to the law. The language was deliberately confusing, full of legal terms that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify, but the meaning was clear enough. The federal government had decided that the railroad's claim took precedence over Lance's, at least temporarily. "You've got 30 days to vacate the premises," Pike continued. "Any interference with railroad operations or personnel will result in arrest and prosecution under federal law." Lance read the order twice, his hands trembling slightly with suppressed anger. 43 years of his life reduced to legal mumbo-jumbo and government stamps. His father's legacy dismissed as a clerical error. His family's future hanging on the whims of men who had never set foot on Wyoming soil before this year. "I'll see you in court," he said finally, handing the paper back to Pike. Morrison smiled thinly. "I certainly hope so, Mr. Rawlings. Judge Morrison's court convenes Monday morning at 9 o'clock. I trust you'll have legal representation." As the 3 men rode away, Lance stood alone in the field where his father had taught him to rope cattle and read weather signs. The silver pocket watch in his vest seemed to tick louder now, marking off the moments until everything he'd ever known disappeared forever. But somewhere in the distance, barely visible against the backdrop of pine-covered hills, a solitary figure on horseback watched and waited. The mountain man had been seen around Laramie County for the better part of 2 weeks, though no one seemed to know where he'd come from or what he wanted. Some folks claimed he was a trapper who'd lost his mind after too many winters alone in the high country. Others suggested he might be a fugitive from justice, hiding out in the wilderness until the law forgot about him. A few of the more superstitious residents whispered that he was the ghost of some long-dead frontiersman, doomed to wander the territory until his earthly business was finished. Whatever the truth about the mysterious stranger, his timing seemed remarkably coincidental. He'd first been spotted just days after the railroad surveyors arrived, watching their work from distant ridgelines. He'd been seen near the courthouse when legal papers were filed and served. And now, as Lance faced the biggest fight of his life, the mountain man had appeared again, a silent witness to injustice played out against the backdrop of the American frontier. Lance pocketed his father's watch and headed home to tell Mary Catherine about the court order. In 6 days, he would stand before a federal judge and argue for the right to keep land that had been in his family for 4 decades. He had no lawyers, no political connections, and no evidence beyond his father's word and an old piece of paper that apparently meant nothing to the territorial bureaucracy. But he had something the railroad men couldn't understand and couldn't buy, the kind of determination that came from knowing your ground was worth dying. For the Laramie County Courthouse stood like a monument to frontier justice on the town's main street. Its sandstone walls, weathered by 20 years of Wyoming wind and snow, built when the territory still rang with gunshots and cattle drives, it represented law and order in a land where both were often in short supply. On this cold Monday morning in November, The building hummed with an unusual energy as ranchers, townspeople, and railroad officials gathered for what everyone knew would be more than just another land dispute. Lance arrived early, wearing his best suit, a somber black wool that Mary Catherine had pressed with extra care the night before. His father's silver pocket watch rested heavy in his vest, and tucked inside his coat pocket was the original deed to the ranch, the paper yellowed with age, but the ink still clear. Young Franklin Davis, his attorney, met him on the courthouse steps, clutching a leather satchel that looked pitifully thin compared to the parade of lawyers following in the railroad company's wake. "Remember what we discussed?" Davis whispered nervously as they climbed the stone steps. "Let me do the talking, unless Judge Morrison asks you a direct question. Keep your answers short and respectful. Judge Cornelius Morrison, no relation to the surveyor," though Lance had his doubts about that coincidence, presided over the courtroom with the bearing of a man accustomed to having his word treated as law. He was a thin, sharp-featured individual in his 60s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked upon. He'd been appointed to the territorial bench by political allies in Washington, and his record showed a consistent favoritism toward business interests over individual property rights. The courtroom filled quickly. In the front rows sat the railroad's legal team, 4 lawyers in expensive Eastern suits, led by a silver-haired man named Charles Pemberton, who was rumored to have connections all the way to the Union Pacific's board of directors. Behind them, railroad executives and surveyors filled 2 more rows, their presence designed to intimidate as much as to observe. Lance and Davis took their seats at the defendant's table, which felt uncomfortably exposed under the weight of so many hostile stares. Behind them, a handful of local ranchers and townspeople had come to witness the proceedings. Most were silent, but their faces showed the careful neutrality of people who understood that powerful interests were at play. As the bailiff called the court to order, Lance noticed a figure slip quietly into the back row, a tall man with wild grey hair and clothes that looked like they'd been tailored by frontier necessity rather than fashion. The Mountain Man. Lance had heard the stories about the mysterious stranger, but this was his first clear look at the fellow. There was something about the man's bearing, the way he carried himself with quiet authority, that suggested he was more than just another curious observer. Judge Morrison gavelled the session to order and called for opening statements. Pemberton rose with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case he couldn't afford to lose. "Your Honor," Pemberton began, his voice carrying the polished authority of expensive legal education. "This case represents a simple matter of correcting a historical oversight. The Denver and Pacific Railroad Company has conducted extensive research into the territorial land records and discovered that the property in question was never properly registered by the alleged claimant. On Benjamin Rawlings in 1841, Pemberton gestured to his assistant, who produced a large map marked with red boundaries that clearly excluded the disputed portion of Lance's ranch. Our survey shows conclusively that Mr. Benjamin Rawlings filed a claim for 800 acres, not the 1,200 acres his son now claims to own. The additional 400 acres, precisely the acreage needed for our right-of-way, remains unclaimed federal land, available for legitimate development under the Pacific Railway Acts. The lawyer's presentation was smooth and professional, backed by charts, graphs, and official-looking documents that had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail. He spoke of federal transportation, imperatives, and the greater good of territorial development, painting the railroad as a force for progress and prosperity that was being unfairly hindered by one man's stubborn refusal to accept documented reality. Furthermore, Your Honor, Pemberton continued, producing what appeared to be a surveyor's map from the 1840s. Territorial records from the period in question show clearly that no Rawlings claim was registered in the disputed area. This map, prepared by federal surveyors in 1842, shows the land as unoccupied and available for future settlement. Lance felt his heart sink as he stared at the fraudulent map. The document looked authentic, aged paper, faded ink, official seals, but he knew it was a lie. His father had described the 1842 survey to him in detail, explaining how the federal surveyors had spent 3 days at the ranch measuring boundaries and confirming Benjamin's claim. They'd even shared meals at the family table and slept in the barn during a sudden snowstorm. When Davis rose to present their case, his nervousness was apparent to everyone in the courtroom. The young lawyer fumbled with his papers and spoke in a voice that barely carried beyond the first row of spectators. "Your Honor, my client's family has lived on and worked this land for 43 years. Benjamin Rawlings established his claim in accordance with all territorial regulations of the time, and the family has maintained continuous occupation and improvement of the property ever since." Davis produced Lance's deed, but even to Lance's eyes, the document looked fragile and questionable compared to the railroad's impressive array of maps and surveys. The paper was genuine, but it lacked the official stamps and certifications that characterized the railroad's presentation. "This deed clearly shows a claim to 1,200 acres, Davis continued, but his voice lacked conviction. "The Rawlings family has paid territorial taxes on the full acreage for 4 decades and has never been challenged on their ownership until now." Judge Morrison examined the deed with obvious skepticism, holding it up to the light as if checking for signs of forgery. "Mr. Davis, do you have any corroborating documentation? Survey records, witness statements, territorial correspondence?" Davis shuffled through his papers desperately. "Your Honor, many of the original territorial records were lost in the Cheyenne courthouse fire of 1870. We've been unable to locate—" "I see," Morrison interrupted. "So you're asking this court to accept a single document of questionable provenance over extensive research conducted by qualified railroad surveyors and verified through territorial archives." Lance watched his case crumble before his eyes. The railroad's lawyers had prepared for every possible challenge, creating a web of false documentation that would be nearly impossible to penetrate without resources the Rawlings family simply didn't possess. They'd even anticipated the Cheyenne courthouse fire, using it as an explanation for why contradictory evidence couldn't be found. The hearing continued for another hour, but the outcome was clear from the moment Pemberton began speaking. Expert witnesses testified about proper surveying techniques. Territorial law experts explained filing requirements, and railroad officials described the vital importance of completing the transcontinental rail connection through Wyoming territory. Through it all, Lance sat in frustrated silence, watching 43 years of his family's work dismissed as a bureaucratic error. His father's pocket watch seemed to tick louder with each passing minute, marking time until the moment when everything Benjamin Rawlings had built would belong to strangers. Davis made a valiant final argument, speaking passionately about the importance of protecting established property rights and honoring the sacrifices of pioneer families. But passion was no match for preparation, and good intentions couldn't overcome the railroad's superior resources and political connections. Judge Morrison retired to consider his decision, though everyone in the courtroom understood that the deliberation was merely a formality. When he returned 15 minutes later, his verdict was delivered in the dispassionate tone of a man announcing the weather forecast. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, this court finds that the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company has established clear and convincing proof of their right to the disputed acreage. The defendant's claim lacks sufficient documentation to overcome the railroad's properly researched and filed petition. The judge's gavel fell like a thunderclap, and Lance felt something die inside his chest. Around him, railroad representatives shook hands and patted each other on the back, while local residents filed out in uncomfortable silence. The mountain man in the back row remained seated, his weathered face unreadable, his pale eyes fixed on something beyond the immediate proceedings. As Lance gathered his few papers and prepared to leave the courthouse, Pemberton approached with what might have been intended as sympathy. "Mr. Rawlings, The railroad company is prepared to offer fair compensation for any improvements you've made to the federal land. We're not unreasonable people." Lance looked at the lawyer for a long moment, measuring the distance between fair compensation and 43 years of back-breaking labor. "This land chose my family, Mr. Pemberton. Your railroad chose money. I reckon we'll see which choice matters more in the end." Outside the courthouse, as Lance and Mary Catherine stood in the bitter November wind, the mountain man approached them with the cautious bearing of someone accustomed to being met with suspicion. "Might I have a word with you, Mr. Rawlings?" the stranger asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. "I believe we have some things to discuss." The mountain man introduced himself simply as Ezra Thorne, though Lance suspected that wasn't the name he'd been born with. They talked briefly on the courthouse steps, while Mary Catherine waited beside the wagon, her face set in the determined expression Lance had learned to recognize over 25 years of marriage. Thorne spoke in measured tones, suggesting they meet the following evening at the ranch to discuss matters of mutual interest. There was something in the stranger's eyes, a depth of knowledge and purpose that made Lance agree, despite his natural caution about trusting men who appeared out of nowhere. Back at the ranch that evening, Lance sat at his kitchen table with his father's cattle brand iron resting before him like a talisman. The iron was simple but distinctive, a BR, enclosed in a circle, burned into countless hides over 4 decades of honest ranching. Benjamin Rawlings had forged it himself during his first winter on the land, hammering out the design on an anvil that still sat in the barn. Every calf born on the ranch bore that mark. Every head of cattle sold carried the Rawlings brand to market. Now, running his fingers over the cold metal, Lance wondered if this iron would be the last remnant of his family's legacy. The railroad had given him 30 days to vacate, but their lawyers were already preparing paperwork to accelerate the timeline. Once the federal marshals arrived with final eviction orders, the Rawlings brand would become nothing more than a curiosity in some distant collector's display. "Tell me about your father's trip to Cheyenne," Mary Catherine said, settling into the chair across from him with a cup of coffee. She'd been unusually quiet since the court hearing, but Lance recognized the calculating look in her eyes. His wife was formulating a plan, and when Mary Catherine Rawlings set her mind to something, mountains had been known to move. Lance closed his eyes and let memory take him back to the stories Benjamin had told during countless winter evenings. Daddy rode to Cheyenne in early spring of 1841, soon as the snow melted enough to make the trip safe. Took him 4 days through country that was still crawling with hostile Sioux war parties. He carried the territorial application in his saddlebags. Along with a survey he'd drawn himself showing boundaries and improvements. The story had become family legend, told and retold until every detail was burned into Lance's memory. Benjamin had arrived in Cheyenne to find the territorial capital in chaos. The governor was dealing with Indian troubles to the north, and the land office was backed up with claims from settlers flooding in from the Oregon Trail. But Benjamin was patient and persistent, camping outside the land office for 3 days until he could meet with the proper officials. Governor Campbell himself signed the deed, Lance continued, picking up the faded document from the table. Daddy said the governor was impressed that he'd held the land for a full year without military protection, driving off raiders and surviving. That terrible winter of 1840, Campbell told him that men like Benjamin Rawlings were exactly what Wyoming territory needed. Mary Catherine studied the deed with fresh eyes, looking for details they might have missed. "The witness signature here, can you make out the name?" Lance squinted at the faded ink. "Looks like E. Thorne, territorial agent." Daddy mentioned the witness was some kind of government man who was in Cheyenne on official business. They both froze as the implications struck them simultaneously. E. Thorne, Ezra Thorne. The mountain man who had approached them outside the courthouse bore the same name as the witness on Benjamin's deed. It could be coincidence. Thorne was common enough, but the timing of the stranger's appearance seemed too perfect for chance. How old would that witness be now? Mary Catherine asked quietly. Lance did the mathematics in his head. If Ezra Thorne had been a young man of 25 in 1841, he would be in his mid-60s now. The mountain man they'd met looked weathered and grey, but he carried himself with the vigour of someone accustomed to hard living rather than advanced age. The connection was possible, perhaps even probable. Before they could explore the thought further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the front window. 3 riders were coming up the lane in the gathering dusk, moving at a deliberate pace that suggested official business rather than a social call. Lance recognized Deputy Marshal Pike's thick silhouette, but the other 2 men were strangers. "Stay inside," Lance told Mary Catherine, reaching for the shotgun that hung above the kitchen door. He stepped onto the front porch as the riders approached, keeping the weapon visible but not directly threatening. Pike dismounted with the casual arrogance of a man backed by federal authority. "Evening, Rawlings. I've got orders to conduct an inventory of improvements on the federal land in preparation for railroad acquisition." The other 2 men introduced themselves as railroad assessors, sent to catalogue buildings, fences, and other structures that the company would need to purchase or remove. They spoke with the clinical detachment of men who viewed human homes as obstacles to progress, discussing the ranch buildings as if Lance and Mary Catherine weren't standing 10 feet away. "Nice barn," one assessor commented, making notes on a clipboard. "Good, solid construction. Probably worth $300 to the right buyer." "The house needs work," his companion replied, studying the weathered logs and stone foundation that Benjamin had laid with his own hands. "Foundation's sound, but the roof wants replacing. Maybe $400 for the structure if they're generous." Lance felt his jaw clench as these strangers appraised his life's work, like merchandise at a cattle auction. The barn had taken his father 3 summers to build, working every evening after the day's ranch duties were finished. The house had sheltered 3 generations of Rawlings' children, protecting them through blizzards, drought, and the constant dangers of frontier life. "You gentlemen are trespassing," Lance said quietly. "This is still my property until the appeals process is complete." Pike smiled unpleasantly. "Actually, Mr. Rawlings, the federal court order grants us access for assessment purposes. Any interference with our duties constitutes obstruction of justice." The assessors spent the next hour measuring buildings, counting fence posts, and estimating the value of improvements that had taken 43 years to complete. They worked with efficient professionalism, reducing Lance's heritage to columns of figures and estimated replacement costs. When they finished, Pike handed him a receipt listing the total compensation value of the ranch improvements, $850. "The railroad company will have a check drawn within the week," Pike announced. "Fair market value for all structures and improvements as required by federal law. $850, less than Lance made selling cattle in a good year, offered in exchange for everything his family had built since Wyoming was wilderness." The amount was so insulting that Lance almost laughed. But the sound that came from his throat was closer to a growl. After the officials rode away, Lance and Mary Catherine stood in their yard, surveying the ranch that had been reduced to a line item in some railroad company's ledger. The silver pocket watch in Lance's vest seemed to tick louder in the evening quiet, counting down the hours until strangers would take possession of their home. "They're moving fast," Mary Catherine observed. "Faster than they need to, even with the court order," Lance nodded grimly. The railroad's eagerness suggested they were worried about something, possibly an appeal, possibly political pressure, or possibly the intervention of someone they couldn't control. Whatever the reason, the company clearly wanted the Rawlings family off the land before complications could arise. As if summoned by their thoughts, a lone rider appeared on the eastern ridge, silhouetted against the last light of day. Even at a distance, Lance recognized the unmistakable figure of Ezra Thorne, watching the ranch with the patient attention of a man accustomed to waiting for the right moment to act. Tomorrow, Lance decided he would hear what the mountain man had to say. Tonight, he would hold his wife close and listen to his Fathers watched tick away the hours of their last days on the land that had chosen the Rawlings family 43 years ago. Ezra Thorne arrived at the ranch the following evening, just as the sun was setting behind the Medicine Bow Mountains, riding a sturdy Mustang that moved with the sure-footed confidence of a horse accustomed to difficult country. Up close, Lance could see that the mountain man carried himself with a military bearing that spoke of years spent in command of other men. Hidden beneath his rough frontier clothing was a worn cavalry saber, its brass hilt polished smooth by decades of handling. "Mr. Rawlings," Thorne said, dismounting with the fluid grace of a much younger man, "I appreciate you agreeing to this conversation. What we discussed tonight could change everything." Lance led him to the front porch, where Mary Catherine had set out coffee and chairs positioned to catch the last light of day. The mountain man accepted the offered refreshments with quiet courtesy, but his pale eyes never stopped moving, cataloguing details with the practiced attention of someone accustomed to evaluating tactical situations. "You mentioned matters of mutual interest," Lance began carefully. "I'm listening." Thorne reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio that had seen considerable wear. From it, he produced a document that made Lance's breath catch in his throat, a commission signed by President Lincoln himself, authorizing one Major Ezra Thorne to conduct covert reconnaissance of Confederate activities in the Western Territories during the war years. "I wasn't just a territorial agent in 1841, Mr. Rawlings. I was conducting advanced scouting for what would become military operations against hostile tribes. Your father's ranch served as an unofficial observation post for federal agents monitoring Sioux movements along the North Platte River." The revelation struck Lance like a physical blow. His father had never mentioned any connection to military intelligence, but it would explain Benjamin's uncanny ability to anticipate Indian raids and his mysterious knowledge of tribal movements that allowed him to protect his cattle and neighbors. "Daddy never said anything about working with the government," Lance said slowly. "He wasn't supposed to," Thorne replied. "Benjamin Rawlings was one of a dozen civilian assets we cultivated along the frontier. He provided information about Indian activity, weather conditions, and safe travel routes. In exchange, he received federal protection for his land claim and advance warning of military operations that might affect his property." Thorne produced another document, a map hand-drawn in Benjamin's distinctive style, showing creek beds, ridgelines, and hidden approaches to the ranch that would be invisible to casual observers. Notations in the margins detailed the movement patterns of various Sioux bands, water sources, and defensive positions that could shelter cavalry patrols. This intelligence helped prevent 3 major raids between 1842 and 1845, Thorne continued. "Your father's observations saved dozens of lives and protected wagon trains. Traveling the Oregon Trail, the government owed him a debt that was never properly acknowledged in the official records." Mary Catherine leaned forward, studying the map with growing understanding. "That's why you witnessed his deed registration. You were his government contact?" "Exactly. I made sure Benjamin's claim was properly filed and registered, but I also ensured that certain details remained classified for security reasons. The full extent of his land holdings was deliberately obscured in the public records to protect his operational value." Lance felt pieces of a 40-year-old puzzle clicking into place. His father's mysterious absences during the 1840s, always explained as hunting trips or cattle drives. The cache of military-issue ammunition Benjamin had kept hidden in the barn. The way neighboring ranchers had always deferred to Benjamin's judgment about Indian troubles and weather patterns. The railroad company discovered some of this, Thorne continued grimly. Their research into territorial records turned up references to classified land agreements. Instead of investigating properly, they decided to use the gaps in the public record to support their fraudulent claim. "Can you prove this?" Lance asked, hope stirring in his chest for the first time since the court hearing. Thorne's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. Mr. Rawlings, I've spent the last 6 months tracking down the original files from 3 different government archives. The railroad company made one critical mistake. They assumed all the records were destroyed in various courthouse fires and bureaucratic purges. They were wrong. The mountain man opened his portfolio again and withdrew a thick bundle of documents, each bearing official seals and signatures that testified to their authenticity. Military correspondence detailing Benjamin's intelligence contributions. Treasury records showing payments made to Civilian Asset BR for services rendered. Most importantly, a complete territorial survey from 1843 that clearly showed the Rawlings claim as 1,200 acres. Properly registered and federally protected, these records were sealed under wartime security classifications, Thorne explained. They'd been stored in military archives in St. Louis, Denver, and Washington. The railroad's lawyers never thought to check military records because they assumed territorial land claims were purely civilian matters. Lance studied the documents with growing amazement. Here was proof not only that his father's claim was legitimate, but that Benjamin Rawlings had been a secret hero whose service to his country had never been publicly acknowledged. The irony was bitter. The government that owed the Rawlings family a debt of gratitude was now trying to steal their land through bureaucratic manipulation. Why didn't you come forward? During the court hearing, Mary Catherine asked. Because I needed to be sure about Judge Morrison first, Thorne replied, his expression darkening. Cornelius Morrison isn't just biased toward business interests, he's actively corrupt. The railroad company has been paying him under the table for favorable rulings in land disputes. If I'd presented this evidence in his court, it would have mysteriously disappeared or been ruled inadmissible on technical grounds. The accusation hung in the evening air like smoke from a distant fire. Lance had suspected Morrison's prejudice, but the suggestion of outright bribery explained the judge's aggressive favoritism toward the railroad company. So what do we do? Lance asked. Take this to a higher court? Better than that, Thorne said, rising from his chair and walking to the porch railing. I've been in contact with federal investigators who are already examining railroad corruption in territorial land acquisitions. Judge Morrison is under surveillance, and the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company is about to face congressional scrutiny for their business practices. Lance felt a surge of something he'd almost forgotten. Genuine hope. For the first time since the railroad surveyors had appeared on his land, it seemed possible that justice might prevail over corruption and political influence. There's going to be a new hearing, Thorne continued. Federal jurisdiction, with a judge who can't be bought. But we need to be careful between now and then. The railroad company has too much invested in this project to give up quietly, and desperate men do dangerous things. As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of approaching horses drifted across the evening stillness. Lance counted at least 4 riders moving fast toward the ranch buildings. In the growing darkness, it was impossible to identify the horsemen, but their urgent pace suggested trouble. Get inside, Thorne said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to the cavalry saber at his side. I have a feeling our conversation is about to be interrupted. The riders were close enough now that Lance could see the glint of metal in the starlight. Not just belt buckles and stirrups, but the unmistakable profiles of drawn weapons. Whatever these men wanted, they weren't planning to ask politely. The 4 riders who thundered into the ranch yard weren't the federal marshals Lance had expected, but something far more dangerous. Hired guns wearing deputy badges that probably weren't worth the tin they were stamped on. Their leader was a lean, cold-eyed man who introduced himself as Captain Wade Morrison, claiming to be Judge Morrison's nephew and a special investigator for the railroad company. Evening? Folks, Morrison said, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. We've had reports of trespassing and interference with federal property. Mind if we take a look around? Ezra Thorne stepped forward with the calm confidence of a man who had faced down worse threats than hired thugs. In his weathered hands, he held a hand-drawn map of secret mountain trails that only he, New paths through the wilderness that could hide a man for months or provide escape routes when conventional roads became too dangerous. "This is private property, Morrison," Thorne said quietly. "You've got no authority here without proper warrants." Morrison's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Actually, Mountain Man, we've got all the authority we need. Federal court order grants us access to assess and secure railroad property. Anyone interfering with that assessment can be arrested for obstruction." Lance watched the confrontation with growing tension, recognizing the setup for what it was. These weren't legitimate law officers conducting official business. They were railroad enforcers sent to intimidate witnesses and eliminate evidence before the federal investigation could get started. The timing was too convenient, coming just hours after Thorne had revealed his documentary evidence. "Let's see those warrants then," Mary Catherine said firmly, stepping onto the porch with a shotgun cradled in her arms. 25 years of frontier life had taught her to recognize predators, whether they wore badges or not. Morrison's expression darkened at being challenged by a woman, but he made no move to produce any official paperwork. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to step back inside and let the men handle this situation. I'd advise you to get off our property before I decide you're claim jumpers and treat you accordingly," Mary Catherine replied, her voice carrying the steel that had sustained her through decades of ranch life. The standoff stretched taut as a fiddle string, with both sides measuring distances and calculating odds. Lance could see Thorne's hand hovering near his cavalry saber, and he quietly shifted position to put himself between the gunman and his wife. 4 armed men against 3 defenders wasn't good odds, but the ranch buildings provided cover, and these weren't military professionals. They were bullies accustomed to intimidating unarmed farmers. The tension broke when one of Morrison's men spotted something that made him curse and point toward the eastern ridge. A line of riders was approaching at a steady pace, too many to count in the darkness, but clearly more than the railroad's hired guns had bargained for. As they drew closer, Lance recognized several neighboring ranchers, including old Henrik Peterson, who had supposedly sided with the railroad. "Trouble, boys?" Peterson called out as he rode into the yard, followed by Tom Bradley from the livery stable and a dozen other local men. "We heard there might be some claim jumpers operating in these parts tonight." Morrison's confidence evaporated as he realized his intimidation party was suddenly outnumbered 3-1 by armed locals who knew the country and had no love for railroad enforcers. His hired guns began glancing nervously at each other, calculating their chances of fighting their way out against men who had grown up hunting and defending their property. "This is federal business," Morrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "You civilians have no jurisdiction here." "Neither do you," Peterson replied calmly. "We checked with Marshal Pike in town before riding out. He doesn't know anything about any federal operation tonight. Says if you're operating under his authority, you forgot to tell him about it." Lance felt a surge of gratitude toward his neighbors, even those who had initially counseled him to accept the railroad settlement offer. When it came down to choosing between corporate bullies and a local family in trouble, the community had closed ranks in the way that frontier settlements always had. Morrison realized his bluff had been called and called off his men with obvious reluctance. "This isn't over, Rawlings. The railroad company has rights that need protecting, and we'll be back with proper authority." "You do that," Thorne said quietly. "And next time, make sure your authority is legitimate. There are federal investigators who take a dim view of men impersonating government officials." After the railroad enforcers retreated into the darkness, the local ranchers gathered around the porch to hear what had brought armed men to the Rawlings ranch on a cold November night. Lance found himself in the awkward position of explaining Thorne's presence without revealing the full extent of the evidence they had discovered. "This gentleman has information that might help with our legal situation," Lance said carefully. "The railroad company seems concerned. Enough about it to send night riders with fake badges." Peterson studied Thorne with the shrewd eyes of a man who had survived 40 years on the frontier by reading character accurately. "You've got the look of a soldier about you, mister." "Where'd you serve?" "Various places," Thorne replied diplomatically. "The important thing is that Mr. Rawlings has been the victim of fraud, and there are people in Washington who need to know about it." The gathering broke up after another hour of quiet conversation, with neighbors departing in small groups to avoid attracting attention from any railroad spies who might be watching the area. Before leaving, Peterson pulled Lance aside for a private word. "I was wrong to tell you to take their settlement," the old rancher said gruffly. "A man's land is his land, regardless of what lawyers say. You fight this thing, Lance. We'll back you however we can." After the last rider disappeared into the darkness, Lance and Mary Catherine sat with Thorne on their front porch, drinking coffee and listening to the night sounds of the Wyoming wilderness. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and an owl called from the cottonwoods along the creek. But these were comforting sounds, the familiar voices of a land that had been home for 43 years. "They'll be back," Thorne said quietly. "Morrison's not going to give up easily, and the railroad has too much money invested in this route to accept defeat gracefully." "Let them come," Mary Catherine said with quiet determination. "This is our home, and we're not leaving it." Thorne smiled at her fierce loyalty, recognizing a kindred spirit in the small woman who faced down armed men with nothing but a shotgun and absolute conviction. "Ma'am, I've fought alongside professional soldiers who didn't have half your courage." Lance checked his father's silver pocket watch, noting that it was nearly midnight. In the morning, they would begin the process of contacting federal investigators and preparing for a new legal battle. But tonight, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of home, he allowed himself to believe that justice might still be possible. The hand-drawn map of secret trails rested safely in Thorne's portfolio, a reminder that even in the most desperate circumstances, there were always alternatives for men with the courage to take unmarked paths through dangerous country. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and underlying tension, as if the entire county was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Lance continued his daily ranch work, but now every horizon held the possibility of trouble, and every stranger in town might be another railroad enforcer. Ezra Thorne had taken to camping in the hills above the ranch, using his bullet-scarred compass, a memento from his cavalry days, to navigate the high country trails while keeping watch for threats approaching from any direction. The compass had been damaged during the Battle of Chickamauga, where a Confederate bullet had struck the brass casing and knocked Thorne unconscious for 6 hours. When he awoke, he found the compass still worked, despite the deep gouge across its face, and he'd carried it through every dangerous mission since then. Now, as he watched over the Rawlings ranch from hidden vantage points, the old compass pointed him toward more than just magnetic north. It guided him toward the confrontation he knew was coming. In town, the atmosphere had grown poisonous with suspicion and divided loyalties. Judge Morrison had begun holding court sessions behind closed doors, hearing railroad business without public notice or opportunity for opposing counsel. Franklin Davis, Lance's young attorney, reported that his requests for case information were being ignored or actively obstructed by court clerks, who suddenly claimed to have no knowledge of pending appeals. The railroad company, meanwhile, had accelerated their construction timeline with suspicious urgency. Survey crews worked around the clock, laying out grades and preparing roadbeds as if they expected no further legal challenges to their plans. Equipment trains arrived daily, unloading rails, ties, and construction materials at a temporary depot established just outside Laramie. The message was clear. The Denver and Pacific Railroad intended to present federal investigators with a fait accompli, arguing that construction delays would cost taxpayers millions of dollars. Mary Catherine had taken to keeping the loaded shotgun within reach at all times, and she'd begun varying her daily routines in ways that would make it difficult for anyone to predict her movements. During her weekly trips to town for supplies, she noticed men watching her from storefront doorways and saloon windows, strangers with the hard faces and careful eyes of hired guns pretending to be traveling merchants. or drifters looking for work. They're waiting for something, she told Lance one evening as they sat by the kitchen fire, speaking in low voices, even within the privacy of their own home. Those men watching me in town, they're not planning to do anything yet, but they're keeping track of where I go and when. Lance nodded grimly. The pressure was building like storm clouds gathering over the mountains, and everyone involved seemed to understand that the current standoff couldn't continue indefinitely. Either the federal investigation would vindicate the Rawlings family's claim, or the railroad would find a way to eliminate the obstacles to their progress through more direct means. The break in the stalemate came from an unexpected direction. Tom Bradley, who owned the livery stable and had been one of Lance's most vocal supporters, arrived at the ranch just after dawn on a cold December morning with news that made everyone's blood run cold. They got to Franklin Davis, Bradley said, his face pale with anger and fear. Found him in his office last night, beaten so bad he can barely speak. Official story is that he surprised burglars who were robbing the safe. But there wasn't anything missing except all the legal papers related to your case. Lance felt his heart sink as he realized the full implications of the attack. Davis had been their only legal advocate, and with his files destroyed and the young lawyer hospitalized, they were left without professional representation just as the federal investigation was beginning to gather momentum. Is he going to recover? Mary Catherine asked. Doc says he'll live, but it'll be months before he's well enough to practice law again. And even then, I doubt he'll want to take on the railroad company after what happened. The message was unmistakable. Anyone who helped the Rawlings family could expect similar treatment. The railroad company was abandoning any pretense of legal propriety and moving toward open intimidation of witnesses, lawyers, and anyone else who might interfere with their plans. Later that morning, Ezra Thorne descended from his mountain camp with troubling intelligence of his own. Using his network of contacts among federal investigators, he had learned that the railroad's political allies in Washington were pressuring the Interior Department to expedite the land transfer process. They're claiming national security interests, Thorne explained, spreading maps across Lance's kitchen table. The argument is that delays in completing the transcontinental rail connection could hamper military transportation and Western territorial defense. It's nonsense, but it's the kind of nonsense that carries weight with politicians who don't understand frontier conditions. Thorne's bullet-scarred compass rested beside the maps, its damaged face catching the lamplight like a reminder of battles fought and survived against overwhelming odds. The mountain man had been studying the terrain around the ranch, identifying defensible positions and escape routes that could be used if the situation deteriorated further. How long do we have? Lance asked. Days, not weeks. The federal investigators are honest men, but they're fighting an uphill battle against political pressure and bureaucratic obstruction. If we're going to present our evidence effectively, it needs to happen soon. That afternoon, Lance made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of waiting passively for events to unfold, he would take the initiative and force a confrontation on his own terms. If the railroad company wanted his land badly enough to resort to violence and intimidation, then they would have to come and take it from him directly. I'm calling for a public meeting, he announced. Tomorrow night at the schoolhouse. Every rancher, every businessman, every voter in Laramie County. Time for folks to hear the whole truth about what's happening here. Mary Catherine looked at him with a mixture of pride and concern. Lance, that's going to paint a target on your back bigger than anything we've faced so far. Maybe so, Lance replied, touching the silver pocket watch in his vest. But my daddy didn't spend 40 years building this ranch just so I could hand it over to thieves without a fight. If there's going to be trouble, let's get it out in the open, where honest people can see what's really happening. Thorne nodded approvingly. Sometimes, the best defense is to force your enemies into the light. Railroad executives are comfortable operating in shadows and back rooms, but they're less effective when their methods are exposed to public scrutiny. As word of the meeting spread throughout the county, both sides began preparing for what everyone understood would be a decisive confrontation. The railroad company would either win public support for their position or be forced to abandon their pretense of legitimacy and rely entirely on corruption and violence. Either way, the long standoff was about to end. The schoolhouse had never held so many people at one time, with overflow crowds spilling out into the December night and straining to hear through the open windows. Ranchers, shopkeepers, railroad workers, and townspeople packed the benches, while others stood along the walls or clustered near the doorway. The air was thick with tension and the smoke from dozens of pipes and cigarettes, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a powder keg than a community meeting. Lance stood at the front of the room beside the teacher's desk, feeling the weight of dozens of stares and the responsibility of speaking for something larger than his own interests. In his coat pocket, folded carefully in an oilskin wrapper, were the sealed military orders that would either vindicate his family or expose them to even greater danger. Ezra Thorne sat in the back row, his weathered face unreadable, but his eyes constantly scanning the crowd for potential threats. Judge Morrison had arrived with an entourage of railroad officials, positioning themselves in the front rows like a jury prepared to render verdict on the proceedings. Caldwell Morrison, the railroad surveyor, sat beside his distant relative with a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained more falsified documents designed to counter whatever evidence Lance might present. "Folks," Lance began, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded room, "I asked you all here tonight because I believe you deserve to know the truth about what's happening to our community. The railroad company claims my family never properly registered our land claim, but I've got evidence that proves otherwise." A murmur ran through the crowd as Lance produced his father's original deed, holding it up for everyone to see. Several people nodded. They remembered Benjamin Rawlings and the kind of man he'd been. But Judge Morrison stood immediately, his face flushed with indignation. "This is highly irregular," Morrison declared. "Legal matters should be decided in proper courts, not in schoolhouse meetings designed to inflame public sentiment." "Sit down, Cornelius," called out Henrik Peterson from the middle of the room. "The man's got a right to speak his piece, and we've got a right to hear it." Lance continued his presentation, explaining the discrepancies between his father's deed and the railroad's survey maps. He described the suspicious timing of the company's legal challenge and the intimidation tactics that had escalated to physical violence against his attorney. The crowd listened with growing attention, many nodding as they recognized patterns of behavior they'd observed in other railroad dealings. Then Lance made the decision that would change everything. "There's something else you all need to know," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "Something about my father's service to this territory that's never been made public before tonight." Ezra Thorne tensed in his seat, understanding that Lance was about to reveal information that had been classified for nearly 30 years. The sealed military orders in Lance's hands represented more than just evidence of his land claim. They were proof of a secret history that powerful people had worked to keep buried. "My father, Benjamin Rawlings, wasn't just a rancher," Lance continued, unfolding the military documents. "From 1841 to 1848, he served as a civilian intelligence asset for the United States Army, providing information about Indian movements and hostile activities that helped protect wagon trains and military operations throughout Wyoming territory." The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Benjamin Rawlings, whom everyone had known as a quiet, hard-working rancher, had been a secret agent for the federal government during some of the most dangerous years in Wyoming's history. The documents Lance displayed bore official seals and signatures that testified to their authenticity, including detailed reports of intelligence gathered at considerable personal risk. Judge Morrison's face had gone pale, but Caldwell Morrison was on his feet, sputtering protests about the relevance of decades-old military records to current land disputes. The railroad officials behind him exchanged worried glances. Clearly unprepared for this development, in what they had assumed would be a straightforward intimidation exercise. These records prove that my father's land claim was not only legitimate, but was protected by federal classification. For security reasons, Lance continued. The territorial records that the railroad company claims to have researched were deliberately incomplete to protect ongoing intelligence operations. Ezra Thorne rose from his seat in the back of the room, and every eye turned toward the mysterious mountain man who had appeared in their community at such a critical moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. My name is Colonel Ezra Thorne, United States Army Intelligence. I was Benjamin Rawlings' commanding officer during his years of service to this country, and I can verify every word his son has just spoken. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Judge Morrison's voice, shrill with desperation. This is preposterous. Military records from the 1840s have no bearing on current territorial law. Actually, Your Honor, Thorne replied with cold precision, they have considerable bearing when those records document federal land grants that were classified for national security reasons. Mr. Rawlings, property was never subject to standard territorial filing procedures because it was protected under military jurisdiction. Thorne walked to the front of the room with measured steps, producing his own portfolio of documents that had been carefully preserved in military archives for 3 decades. The crowd watched in fascination as he spread maps, correspondence, and official reports across the teacher's desk, creating an undeniable record of Benjamin Rawlings' contributions to territorial security. Furthermore, Thorne continued, my investigation has revealed that the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company has knowingly falsified territorial records to support their fraudulent land claim. They've bribed territorial officials, destroyed legitimate documents, and conspired to defraud a family whose patriarch died in service to his country. The accusations hung in the air like gun smoke, and Lance could see the railroad officials calculating their options as their carefully constructed legal strategy crumbled before their eyes. Caldwell Morrison was frantically shuffling through his papers, looking for some argument that could counter the mountain of evidence being presented against his clients. Judge Morrison stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and fear. I'll not sit here and listen to slanderous accusations against legitimate business interests and territorial officials. This meeting is over. No, Cornelius, said a new voice from the doorway. I think it's just getting started. Every head turned toward the entrance, where a tall man in a federal marshal's uniform stood silhouetted against the night sky. Behind him, Lance could see other figures, men with the bearing and equipment of serious federal investigators rather than local political appointees. Marshal David Garrett, United States Department of Justice, the newcomer announced, stepping into the crowded schoolhouse. We're here to investigate allegations of conspiracy, fraud, and corruption in territorial land transactions. Judge Morrison, you're under arrest for accepting bribes and obstructing federal investigations. The next few minutes passed in chaos as federal marshals moved through the crowd, arresting Judge Morrison and several railroad officials while securing documents and evidence. Caldwell Morrison attempted to flee through a side window but was tackled by Henrik Peterson and Tom Bradley, who seemed to take considerable satisfaction in delivering the corrupt surveyor to federal custody. Through it all, Lance stood beside the teacher's desk, still holding his father's military orders and watching 43 years of injustice finally being addressed by honest lawmen. The silver pocket watch in his vest seemed to tick more quietly now, as if time itself had slowed to acknowledge the magnitude of what was happening. Ezra Thorne approached him as the arrests continued, his weathered face showing something that might have been satisfaction. Your father would be proud, Lance. He always said this land would take care of the people who respected it. As the federal marshals led their prisoners into the night, Lance looked out over the crowd of neighbors and friends who had gathered to hear the truth about his family's struggle. These were good people who understood the difference between right and wrong, even when that difference was obscured by legal complexities and political corruption. The railroad company's conspiracy had been exposed, but Lance knew the fight wasn't over yet. Powerful interests had too much invested in the Wyoming route to accept defeat gracefully, and desperate men with unlimited resources could still pose considerable danger. But tonight, for the first time in months, justice seemed possible. The week following the arrests passed in a whirlwind of federal investigators, newspaper reporters, and legal proceedings that transformed the quiet town of Laramie into the center of a territorial scandal that reached all the way to Washington. Lance found himself at the eye of the storm, his ranch house serving as an unofficial headquarters for federal marshals who were methodically dismantling the railroad company's web of corruption and fraud. Marshal David Garrett had established a temporary command post in Lance's kitchen, spreading evidence across every available surface, while conducting interviews with witnesses who had been too frightened to speak openly before the arrests. The most damning piece of evidence was the original land grant certificate that Colonel Thorne had retrieved from military archives, a document that proved beyond any doubt that Benjamin Rawlings had received federal protection for his 1,200-acre claim in recognition of his intelligence services. The certificate bore the signatures of 3 territorial governors, 2 military commanders, and a federal land commissioner who had personally visited the Rawlings Ranch in 1847 to verify the extent of Benjamin's contributions to territorial security. More importantly, it contained detailed surveys that matched Lance's father's original deed exactly, disproving every claim the railroad company had made about improper filing or inadequate documentation. "This is the smoking gun we needed," Garrett explained to Lance as they examined the faded document under lamplight. "The railroad's lawyers built their entire case on the assumption that your father's military service records had been lost or destroyed. They never imagined that someone would have preserved the classified files that prove their fraud." Colonel Thorne had spent the week traveling between Cheyenne and Denver, coordinating with federal investigators who were uncovering similar railroad frauds throughout the Wyoming territory. The Denver and Pacific Railroad Company, it appeared, had been systematically falsifying land records and bribing territorial officials to secure valuable rights-of-way at a fraction of their actual cost. "They got greedy," Thorne explained during one of his evening visits to the ranch. "If they'd targeted only unclaimed federal land, they might have gotten away with it. But when they started going after established homesteads with clear titles, they created too many victims who were willing to fight back. The legal proceedings were complicated by the fact that Judge Morrison's court had been compromised, requiring federal authorities to bring in a new judge from Colorado Territory to review all pending cases. Judge Harrison Fletcher arrived in Laramie with a reputation for absolute honesty and a particular distaste for corporate corruption that had made him unpopular with business interests throughout the West. Fletcher was a small, gray-haired man who spoke in measured tones and asked penetrating questions that cut through legal obfuscation like a sharp knife through butter. During his first day of hearings, he voided every land ruling that Morrison had made in favor of the railroad company, declaring that the entire judicial process had been tainted by corruption and bribery. "This court will not honor decisions made by a judge who was bought and paid for by the very interests he was supposed to regulate," Fletcher announced from the bench. "Every case involving the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company will be reheard under proper legal procedures." The railroad's response was swift and predictable. Unable to rely on legal corruption, the company began pressuring federal politicians to intervene on their behalf, arguing that delays in railroad construction would harm national economic interests and territorial development. Telegrams flew between Laramie and Washington as lobbyists worked desperately to salvage their clients' investment. Meanwhile, the physical intimidation that had characterized the company's earlier tactics escalated into something approaching open warfare. Railroad security forces, reinforced by hired guns from as far away as Kansas and Colorado, established armed camps along the proposed route and began patrolling the countryside with the aggressive confidence of an occupying army. Lance's ranch became a particular focus of attention, with armed men maintaining constant surveillance from distant ridgelines and following Mary Catherine whenever she traveled to town for supplies. The message was clear, even if the legal battle was lost. The railroad company intended to make life so dangerous and unpleasant for the Rawlings family that they would eventually abandon their property voluntarily. "They're testing our resolve," Colonel Thorne observed during a strategy meeting in Lance's parlor. "Corporate executives in Denver are gambling that federal investigators will eventually lose interest if they can't show immediate progress. They figure if they can hold out long enough, political pressure will force Washington to compromise." Marshal Garrett nodded grimly. "They're not entirely wrong. I've got orders to wrap up this investigation within the month. And there are powerful people in Congress who want this railroad built regardless of how it gets done." The pressure was taking its toll on everyone involved. Mary Catherine had developed dark circles under her eyes, from sleeping with one ear, always listening for trouble. And Lance found himself checking his father's silver pocket watch compulsively, as if measuring time until some undefined deadline arrived. Even Colonel Thorne, who had faced down Confederate cavalry and hostile Indian war parties, seemed tense as the situation spiraled toward an inevitable confrontation. The breaking point came on a gray December morning when Lance discovered that someone had poisoned his cattle's water supply during the night. 12 head of prime beef cattle lay dead along Willow Creek, their bodies testament to the railroad company's willingness to destroy anything that stood in their way. The poisoning was clearly deliberate. The creek ran clean above and below the ranch, but the section that crossed Lance's property had been contaminated with enough arsenic to kill everything that drank from it. "This is a declaration of war," Lance said quietly, standing among the dead cattle with Marshal Garrett and Colonel Thorne. "They're not even pretending to be civilized anymore." Thorne knelt beside one of the dead steers, examining the evidence with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to investigating atrocities. "Arsenic poisoning, probably administered sometime after midnight. They would have needed at least 20 pounds of the stuff to contaminate this much water effectively. Can we prove the railroad company was responsible?" Garrett asked. "We don't need to prove it," Lance replied, his voice carrying a hardness that his wife had rarely heard in 25 years of marriage. "Everyone in the county knows who did this, and everyone knows why. The question is whether we're going to let them get away with it." That afternoon, Lance made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of waiting for federal investigators to build a legal case against the railroad company, he would force the issue by calling their bluff directly. If the Denver and Pacific Railroad wanted his land badly enough to resort to murder and sabotage, they would have to come and take it from him in broad daylight, in front of witnesses who could testify to their methods. "I'm calling them out," Lance announced to the assembled investigators. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to ride to their construction camp and demand they cease all operations on disputed territory until the legal proceedings are complete. If they refuse, then everyone will see exactly what kind of people we're dealing with." Mary Catherine looked at her husband with a mixture of pride and terror. "Lance, they'll kill you. You saw what they did to the cattle. They won't hesitate to do worse to you." "Maybe," Lance acknowledged. "But I'm tired of hiding on my own property and waiting for other people to fight my battles. My daddy built this ranch with his own hands, and he didn't raise me to let bullies steal it through poison and threats." Colonel Thorne studied Lance with the calculating eyes of a professional soldier evaluating a tactical situation. "If you're determined to force a confrontation, then we need to do it properly. This isn't a job for one man on horseback. It's a military operation that requires planning and coordination. Marshal Garrett reluctantly agreed to support the plan, recognizing that Lance was right about the need to force the railroad company into the open where their methods could be properly documented. If we're going to do this, we do it by the book. Federal marshals will be present to arrest anyone who commits crimes, and we'll have enough witnesses to ensure that whatever happens gets reported accurately. As evening approached, Lance stood on his front porch, looking out over the land that had been his family's home for 43 years. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation between everything his father had built and the corporate interests that wanted to sweep it all away in the name of progress and profit. The original land grant certificate rested safely in Marshal Garrett's custody, representing not just legal evidence but the tangible proof that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. The silver pocket. Watch in Lance's vest ticked steadily toward whatever tomorrow would bring, measuring out the last hours of uncertainty before the truth would finally be settled once and for all. In the distance, cooking fires from the railroad's armed camps dotted the horizon like malevolent stars, marking the positions of men who had been paid to ensure that the Denver and Pacific Railroad got what it wanted. But Lance Rawlings had something that money couldn't buy, the absolute conviction that came from knowing his ground was worth defending, and the support of neighbors who understood that some principles were more important than profit margins or construction. Schedules. Tomorrow would prove whether that was enough. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Wyoming territory, painting the snow-covered peaks of the Medicine Bow Mountains in shades of pink and gold that reminded Lance of his father's stories about the beauty that made this land worth fighting for. He stood in his yard adjusting the saddle on his best horse, a sturdy bay gelding that had carried him through countless seasons of ranch work and would now carry him toward the most important confrontation of his life. Marshal Garrett and his federal investigators had positioned themselves at strategic points along the route to the railroad construction camp, ready to observe and document whatever transpired when Lance delivered his ultimatum to the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company. Colonel Thorne rode beside Lance, his cavalry experience evident in the way he sat his horse and scanned the terrain for potential ambush points. Both men understood that they were riding into a situation that could explode into violence with very little provocation. The railroad's construction camp sprawled across a natural meadow 3 miles east of the Rawlings Ranch, a temporary city of canvas tents, equipment sheds, and supply wagons that testified to the enormous scale of the transcontinental railroad project. Smoke rose from dozens of cooking fires, and the sound of hammers and saws echoed across the prairie as work crews prepared materials for the next phase of construction. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles at ready, their presence making it clear that the railroad company expected trouble. As Lance and Thorne approached the camp, workers stopped their activities to watch the two riders with obvious curiosity and concern. These were mostly honest laborers, Irish immigrants, former soldiers, and displaced farmers who had come west looking for steady wages and a chance to build something that would outlast their own lives. They had no personal quarrel with Lance Rawlings, but they understood that their paychecks depended on the railroad company's success. Charles Pemberton, the railroad's lead attorney, emerged from the largest tent to meet them, flanked by Captain Wade Morrison and a dozen hired guns who made no effort to conceal their weapons. Pemberton's expensive suit looked out of place in the wilderness setting, but his confidence remained unshaken despite the legal setbacks his company had suffered in recent days. "Mr. Rawlings," Pemberton called out in a voice that carried across the construction site, "I understand you have something to say to us. I hope you've come to discuss reasonable terms for resolving our differences." Lance dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. Behind him, he could sense the tension of dozens of armed men who were waiting for any excuse to settle this dispute through violence rather than negotiation. The notarized witness statement that would expose the railroad's criminal conspiracy rested in his coat pocket, a single piece of paper that represented the difference between justice and corporate theft. "Mr. Pemberton," Lance replied, his voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air, "I've come to inform you that all construction activities on disputed territory must cease immediately until federal courts resolve the question of legal ownership. Your company is trespassing on land that belongs to my family, and I'm formally demanding that you remove your equipment and personnel." A murmur ran through the crowd of workers as they realized they were witnessing more than just a business disagreement. Some of the men had heard stories about Benjamin Rawlings and the kind of man he'd been, and they understood that his son was continuing a fight that went deeper than simple property rights. Pemberton's smile was thin and condescending. "Mr. Rawlings, I'm afraid that's impossible. The Denver and Pacific Railroad Company has invested millions of dollars in this route, and we have federal contracts that require us to complete construction on schedule. Your personal grievances cannot be allowed to interfere with the national interest." "The national interest," Lance repeated slowly, tasting the words like something bitter. "Is that what you call bribing judges and falsifying territorial records? Is that what you call poisoning cattle and threatening families?" The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke, and Lance could see some of the railroad workers exchanging uncomfortable glances. These men might be willing to work for a company that bent legal rules, but outright criminality was something different, something that could put their own families at risk if federal investigators decided to prosecute everyone involved in the railroad's operations. Captain Morrison stepped forward with his hand resting on his pistol grip, his face flushed with anger at being publicly accused of criminal activity. "You've got a lot of nerve coming here and making accusations you can't prove, Rawlings. Maybe it's time someone taught you some manners." The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with dozens of armed men on both sides measuring distances and calculating odds. Lance could feel the weight of his father's silver pocket watch in his vest, marking the seconds until words gave way to action. Everything that had happened over the past months, the legal battles, the intimidation, the gradual escalation toward violence, had led to this single moment when the truth would finally be settled. Colonel Thorne urged his horse forward, positioning himself where he could cover Lance's back while keeping both hands visible. The old soldier's presence served as a reminder that this confrontation involved more than just a land dispute between neighbors. It was a test of whether honest men could still find justice in a territory where money and political influence seemed to trump law and decency. The tension stretched taut as Captain Morrison's hand tightened on his pistol grip, but before violence could erupt, Marshal Garrett's voice rang out across the construction camp with the authority of federal law enforcement. "That's far enough, Morrison," Garrett called, riding into the clearing with 6 deputy marshals at his back. "Nobody draws iron while federal investigators are present. This is official government business." Morrison's face twisted with frustration, but he kept his weapon holstered as federal marshals positioned themselves strategically around the confrontation. Lance felt a surge of relief at the lawmen's arrival, though he understood that their presence only delayed the inevitable conflict rather than resolving it. Pemberton attempted to regain control of the situation with lawyerly bluster. "Marshal Garrett, this is private property belonging to the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company. These men are trespassing and interfering with legitimate business operations." "Actually, Mr. Pemberton," Lance said quietly, reaching into his coat pocket, "that's exactly what we're here to discuss." The notarized witness statement emerged from Lance's coat like a sword from its sheath, a single sheet of paper that represented months of investigation and the testimony of honest men who had finally found the courage to speak truth to power. The document bore the signatures of 3 territorial officials who had been present when Judge Morrison accepted bribes from railroad representatives, along with detailed descriptions of falsified land records and conspiracy to defraud legitimate property owners. This statement was signed yesterday by Territorial Clerk Samuel Hayes, Surveyor William Patterson, and Land Office Commissioner Robert Sullivan, Lance announced, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. All three men have testified under oath that they witnessed Judge Morrison accepting payments from your company in exchange for favorable land rulings. The impact of the revelation was immediate and devastating. Several railroad workers began backing away from their supervisors, understanding that they were witnessing the exposure of criminal conspiracy that could destroy everyone associated with the project. Pemberton's confident facade cracked as he realized that his carefully constructed legal strategy had been built on quicksand. Furthermore, Colonel Thorne added, producing his own document, federal investigators have uncovered evidence that the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company has been systematically falsifying territorial records throughout Wyoming, Colorado, and Nebraska. This isn't just about the Rawlings Ranch. It's about a pattern of fraud that extends across the entire Western Territory. Marshal Garrett stepped forward to accept the witness statement, examining it with the careful attention of a lawman who understood its significance. Mr. Pemberton, based on this evidence and ongoing federal investigation, I'm placing you and your associates under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and corruption of territorial officials. You can't do this. Pemberton protested, his professional composure finally cracking. The railroad company has political connections that reach all the way to Washington. You'll regret interfering with our operations. The only thing I regret, Garrett replied calmly, is that it took this long to expose your criminal enterprise. Captain Morrison made one last desperate play for control, drawing his pistol with the reckless desperation of a man who saw his world collapsing. Nobody's arresting anybody. This railroad is going through, and anyone who tries to stop it. His threat was cut short by the distinctive click of Colonel Thorne's cavalry pistol being cocked, the sound sharp and clear in the cold morning air. The old soldier had drawn with the fluid speed of someone whose survival had depended on quick reactions during countless dangerous missions. I wouldn't finish that sentence if I were you. "My captain," Thorne said quietly, "you're outnumbered, outgunned, and on the wrong side of federal law. Make the smart choice." Morrison looked around the camp and realized that his hired guns were facing not only federal marshals but also a growing crowd of railroad workers who wanted no part of an armed confrontation with legitimate law enforcement. The laborers understood that their paychecks weren't worth spending years in federal prison, and they began moving away from the company supervisors who had led them into this situation. Faced with the collapse of his authority and the prospect of a gunfight he couldn't win, Morrison slowly lowered his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. The gesture seemed to drain all the fight out of the remaining railroad officials, who submitted to arrest with the resigned acceptance of men who had gambled everything and lost. As federal marshals secured the prisoners and began cataloging evidence of the railroad's criminal activities, Lance stood among the abandoned construction equipment and realized that the fight was finally over. The Denver and Pacific Railroad Company's Wyoming operation would be shut down pending federal investigation, and the falsified land claims that had threatened his family's ranch were now exposed as the criminal conspiracy they had always been. The one sentence that had changed everything wasn't spoken in a courtroom. It was written in the notarized witness statement that proved honest. Testimony could still triumph over corporate corruption and political influence. Colonel E. Thorne approached Lance as the prisoners were loaded into wagons for transport to federal custody. "Your father would be proud, son. He always believed that truth had a way of surfacing when good men were willing to stand up for what's right." 3 months later, the spring of 1883 brought new grass to the Rawlings Ranch and a sense of peace that Lance hadn't felt since the railroad surveyors first appeared on his property. The legal battles were finished. The corrupt officials were serving prison sentences in federal facilities, and the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company had been forced to find an alternative route that didn't involve stealing land from honest ranchers. Judge Harrison Fletcher had issued a final ruling that not only confirmed the Rawlings family's ownership of their 1,200 acres, but also established legal precedent for protecting other homesteaders who had been victimized by similar railroad frauds. The decision cited Benjamin Rawlings' military service as an example of the kind of civilian contributions that deserved federal protection rather than corporate exploitation. Lance stood on his front porch on a warm April morning, watching Mary Catherine tend to her garden, while their neighbor Henrik Peterson helped repair fence line that had been damaged during the winter. The silver pocket watch in his vest ticked with the steady rhythm of normal time, rather than the desperate countdown to catastrophe that had characterized the previous year. Colonel Ezra Thorne had decided to stay in Wyoming territory, accepting a position as federal land agent responsible for investigating and preventing similar railroad frauds throughout the region. His knowledge of territorial history and military records made him invaluable to federal investigators who were working to clean up decades of corporate corruption and political manipulation. The railroad companies aren't giving up, Thorne had explained during one of his regular visits to the ranch. They're just getting more careful about following proper legal procedures. There's still a transcontinental railroad to be built, but it's going to be done honestly or not at all. The new family portrait that now hung above the Rawlings family mantelpiece told the story of their victory in ways that words never could. The photograph, taken by a traveling artist who had heard about their legal triumph, showed Lance and Mary Catherine standing proudly beside their home, with Colonel Thorne positioned slightly behind them in the uniform of a federal land agent. The image captured not just their physical appearance, but something deeper, the quiet satisfaction of people who had fought for principle and won. Mary Catherine had insisted on including Thorne in the portrait, arguing that he was as much family as any blood relative could be. "That man saved our home and honored your father's memory," she'd said firmly. "He belongs in this picture." The photograph had become something of a local symbol, copied and displayed in businesses throughout Laramie County as a reminder that ordinary citizens could still find justice when they had the courage to stand up for their rights. The territorial newspaper had published the image along with a detailed account of the railroad conspiracy, helping to educate other communities about the tactics that corporate interests used to manipulate legal systems. Lance's relationship with his neighbors had been transformed by the experience of fighting the railroad together. Men like Henrik Peterson, who had initially counseled him to accept the company's settlement offer, now sought his advice on legal matters and property disputes. The shared struggle had created bonds of mutual respect that would last for generations. "You did something important here," Peterson had told Lance during a recent conversation. "Not just for your family, but for all of us. When big companies see that they can't intimidate honest ranchers, it makes them think twice about trying similar schemes." The financial impact of their legal victory extended beyond simply keeping their land. The federal government had awarded the Rawlings family compensation for the stress and damage caused by the fraudulent legal proceedings, providing enough money to make improvements to the ranch that had been deferred during years of economic uncertainty. New buildings, better fencing, and an expanded herd of cattle testified to the family's renewed prosperity. More importantly, Lance had received official recognition of his father's military service, including a posthumous commendation for Benjamin Rawlings' contributions to territorial security. The document, signed by the Secretary of War himself, acknowledged that Benjamin's intelligence work had helped prevent conflicts that could have cost hundreds of lives and disrupted westward expansion for decades. On quiet evenings, Lance often sat on his porch, reading the letters that arrived regularly from other ranchers and homesteaders who had heard about their legal victory. Families from as far away as Montana and Colorado wrote to ask for advice about fighting similar railroad schemes, and Lance took pride in sharing the lessons he'd learned about the importance of preserving documentation and seeking federal assistance when local courts were compromised. Colonel Thorne had become a regular dinner guest, sharing stories of his investigations and updates on the ongoing prosecutions of railroad officials throughout the Western Territories. The old soldier seemed to have found new purpose in his civilian role, using his military experience to protect honest settlers from the kind of corporate predation that had once threatened the Rawlings family. "Your father understood something that a lot of people forget," Thorne told Lance during one such evening visit. "This land doesn't just belong to the people who live on it. It belongs to their children and their children's children. When you fight to protect your property, you're fighting to preserve something that matters more than any railroad company's profit margins." As summer approached and the anniversary of their legal triumph drew near, Lance found himself thinking often about the lessons the experience had taught him. Justice wasn't something that could be taken for granted. It required constant vigilance and the willingness of ordinary people to stand up for extraordinary principles. The railroad companies would find other routes and other opportunities, but the precedent set by honest ranchers who refused to be intimidated would protect future generations of Wyoming settlers. The new family portrait hanging above the mantelpiece served as a daily reminder that some victories were worth any amount of struggle, and that the bonds forged in adversity could last a lifetime.